This deep dive, we're going to explore a case. It continues to fascinate and disturb people. The story of Anneliese Michel.
Yeah, a case that really gets to the heart of, some pretty fundamental questions about faith and science and the nature of suffering. And we've got two really interesting sources to help us kind of unpack it all. We've got Anneliese's Wikipedia entry, which lays out all the basic facts, and then also a 2024 article from Infobae, which dives into some of the more chilling details.
Right, so we've got kind of the broad strokes and then a closer look at the human side of this tragedy. What we're going to do in this deep dive is explore the events of her life and the controversy surrounding her death and the lasting impact this case has had on both religious and medical practices.
Yeah, one of the things that makes this case so compelling, I think, is that it forces us to confront the limits of our understanding. Where do we draw the line between faith and reason, and what happens when those two worlds collide?
Okay, so let's start with Anneliese's early life. Both sources kind of paint a picture of a young woman, raised in a deeply devout Catholic family in Germany. Then at just 16 years old, she starts experiencing these violent seizures and is diagnosed with epilepsy.
And this is where things start to get a little bit complicated. The medication doesn't seem to be improving her condition, and she develops severe depression. Now, from a medical perspective, you might start to consider other potential diagnoses, maybe explore neurological or psychological factors. But for Anneliese and her family, the explanation lay elsewhere.
They believe she was possessed right, that her suffering was rooted in something spiritual. And the Infobae article really paints a vivid picture of her deteriorating condition. Aversion to religious objects, hearing voices, exhibiting really unusual behaviors. It mentions her hiding under tables, barking like a dog, even eating spiders.
Yeah, these behaviors, while, obviously disturbing, could potentially be understood as manifestations of, very severe mental health crisis. But in the context of her devout upbringing and her family's very strong belief system, they were interpreted through a very different lens.
So even though Anneliese was receiving psychiatric treatment, her family became convinced that she needed a different kind of help, an exorcism.
And that's where these two priests, Ernst Alt and Arnold Renz, enter the picture. They agree to perform the ritual. They're convinced that Anneliese is indeed possessed. And this raises a crucial question. What convinces these priests that this was a case of demonic possession, especially when medical professionals were already involved?
Well, the Infobae article describes how Anneliese's symptoms seemed to worsen during prayers and around religious objects. Plus, there were those recordings. 42 hours of audio captured during the exorcisms, and apparently you can hear her voice changing, speaking in different tongues, claiming to be possessed by multiple demons, including Lucifer, Cain, Judas Iscariot, Nero, even Hitler.
Those recordings are incredibly disturbing to listen to, even just snippets. You can hear the intensity of her suffering, the rawness of her voice. But even with those recordings, I think it's important to remember that there are different ways to interpret what we're hearing. Some might hear evidence of demonic possession, while others might hear the desperate cries of a young woman struggling with a really profound mental and emotional breakdown.
So how did the exorcisms themselves actually unfold? The Wikipedia entry mentions there were 67 sessions, over 11 months, sometimes twice a week, lasting up to 4 hours. Can you imagine the toll that must have taken on Anneliese?
And the Infobae article really describes the rituals as incredibly grueling. Anneliese was reportedly restrained, her physical condition, deteriorating rapidly, severely malnourished, weighing only 30 kilograms at the time of her death. She inflicted injuries on herself, biting her own hand and arm, and even ruptured her knee ligaments from performing hundreds of genuflections a day.
It's heartbreaking to think about, the level of suffering she endured. But even with all this, the exorcisms continued, until her death on July 1st, 1976.
Yeah, and that's where the case takes a truly tragic turn. Anneliese's death, at just 23 years old, was attributed to malnutrition and dehydration, a tragic end to a life marked by both physical and spiritual torment. And then the question becomes, one of responsibility, like, who's accountable for Anneliese's death? Was it the priests who performed the exorcisms? Was it her parents, who authorized them? Or was it a failure of the medical system to adequately address her underlying condition?
Yeah, it's a question that went all the way to the courtroom. Anneliese's parents and the two priests were charged with negligent homicide for failing to provide her with the necessary medical care. And the trial really, I think, brought to light the tensions between religious beliefs and legal obligations.
What's so fascinating at this trial is that it wasn't about proving or disproving the existence of demonic possession. The court wasn't really concerned with the validity of religious belief at all. Instead, it focused on the actions, or rather inactions, of those involved. The question was whether they had a legal duty to provide medical care to someone who was clearly suffering, regardless of their beliefs about the cause of that suffering.
And they were all found guilty, right?
Yeah, they were, although the sentences were relatively lenient. The parents received a 6-month suspended jail sentence, while the priests were given 3 years probation.
So this case really forced a national conversation in Germany about religious freedom, parental rights, the limits of faith healing. It challenged people to think about how far belief should extend when it comes to someone's health and well-being.
And the impact extended far beyond Germany, though. The Catholic Church itself really felt the reverberations of this case. In fact, the Wikipedia entry mentions that the Vatican revised its exorcism rites in 1999, partly in response to what happened to Anneliese.
So they were acknowledging that changes needed to be made.
Absolutely. The revised rites placed much greater emphasis on medical evaluations before. Authorizing an exorcism, it's like they were trying to find a way to reconcile faith and medicine, recognizing that, what might appear to be demonic possession could in fact be a manifestation of mental illness.
I think it's interesting that, even though the church revised its practices, it didn't outright condemn the actions of the priests involved in Anneliese's case. It's like they're acknowledging the need for a more nuanced approach, recognizing these gray areas where faith and science intersect.
Yeah, it highlights the delicate balancing act the church faces. On the one hand, they uphold the reality of spiritual warfare and, the power of exorcism. But on the other hand, they also recognize the importance of modern medicine and the ethical obligation to, care for the sick.
And then there's the impact that this case had on popular culture, especially the 2005 film The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which was directly inspired by Anneliese's story. Do you think the film helped or hindered public understanding of this really complex issue?
That's a great question. On the one hand, I think the film brought this conversation into the mainstream, prompted people to think about the possibilities of demonic possession and, the challenges of distinguishing it from mental illness. But on the other hand, as a fictionalized account, it also potentially sensationalized the issue, maybe creating more fear and misunderstanding than genuine insight.
Yeah, for me the film, while scary, also raised a lot of questions about the responsibility of the church and the individuals involved. It made me think about how easily someone's suffering could be misinterpreted, and how important it is to consider all perspectives before resorting to these extreme measures.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable takeaway, and it's something that the Infobae article touches upon as well. The article presents a range of perspective on the case, from those who believe that Anneliese was a true victim of demonic forces, to those who believe that she was tragically failed by a system that prioritized religious dogma over her well-being.
Yeah, it's almost like this case, even decades later, serves as a kind of Rorschach test, reflecting our own beliefs and anxieties about the unknown. What do you think is behind the enduring fascination with Anneliese Michel's story?
I think it taps into something deep within us, a primal fear of the unseen, of forces beyond our control. And I think it also forces us to confront the limits of our own understanding, the boundaries between what we can explain and what remains shrouded in mystery.
It makes you wonder, in our increasingly secular world, do we still need these stories, these reminders that there might be more to reality than meets the eye?
That's a fascinating question, and perhaps one that each listener needs to answer for themselves. We dismiss these stories as mere superstition, or do we allow them to challenge our assumptions, to make us consider the possibility that there are dimensions to our existence that science can't fully explain?
It's interesting how this case still generates so much debate, even after all these years. Some people view Anneliese as a martyr, a testament to the power of faith, and then others see her story as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of religious extremism.
What strikes me is that both interpretations, while seemingly contradictory, actually speak to the same underlying human need. The need to make sense of suffering, to find meaning in tragedy. Whether we attribute Anneliese's torment to, demonic forces or to a profound psychological breakdown, we're still grappling with the same fundamental questions. Why her? Why this suffering?
And I think that's what makes this case so unsettling. It just resists easy answers. It challenges our assumptions about, the nature of reality, about the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual.
Yeah, there's this detail in the Infobae article that really stuck with me. It mentions that even after the exorcisms began, Anneliese continued to take her medication for epilepsy. And this suggests, a level of uncertainty, even within her family. about the true nature of her affliction.
It's almost as if they were hedging their bets, acknowledging that maybe there wasn't just one explanation, that perhaps the spiritual and the medical weren't mutually exclusive.
Exactly. It highlights the complexity of these situations where belief systems and medical diagnoses collide. It's not always a clear-cut case of either or.
And it makes you wonder if Anneliese had been born in a different time in a different place. Would her story have unfolded differently? Would she have received a different diagnosis? Would her family have sought different solutions?
Right. Those are questions that we can't answer definitively, of course, but I think they point to the importance of context, of understanding how cultural and historical factors really shape our perceptions of illness, of suffering, of the very nature of reality itself.
Yeah, this deep dive has really been a journey into some challenging territory. We've explored, the dark side of faith, the limitations of science, and the enduring mystery of the human mind.
And I think ultimately what Anneliese Michel's story teaches us is the importance of compassion, of humility, of recognizing that, our understanding of the world is always incomplete.
It's a reminder that even in our search for answers, we should never lose sight of the human cause of suffering, the need to approach these mysteries with sensitivity and respect.
And perhaps most importantly, it's a call to action, a call to be more mindful of those who are struggling, to seek understanding rather than judgment, and to really advocate for compassionate care for all who are in need, regardless of the nature of their suffering.
So to our listeners, we leave you with this final thought. In a world where certainty is often elusive, perhaps the most important thing we can offer each other is empathy, a willingness to listen, to learn, and to walk alongside one another in the face of the unknown.